The autumn rain hammered Dodge City like bullets against a tin roof, turning Front Street into a river of mud and regret. In the flickering gaslight of the Long Branch Saloon, cowboys and cattle barons alike huddled over whiskey, their voices lost in the storm's fury. But 3 miles east, where the prairie stretched endless and dark, the lonely rancher sat alone in his cabin, listening to ghosts in the wind. Thomas "Tom" Mitchell, though no one in Dodge City knew that name anymore, had built his life around silence. 3 years had passed since he'd ridden into town with nothing but a horse, a gun, and secrets that weighed heavier than lead. The locals called him Rancher and nothing more. He preferred it that way. Names had power, and power had destroyed everything he'd once held dear. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." The knock on his door came at midnight, soft as a whisper but urgent as a gunshot. Tom's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 on his hip, old habits from a lawman's life that refused to die. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw nothing but darkness and the skeletal outline of his barn. Another knock, weaker this time. Tom opened the door to find a child, a girl no more than 8 years old, soaked to the bone and shivering like a leaf in a tornado. Her dress, once blue, was torn and stained with something darker than mud. In her small fist, she clutched a crumpled piece of paper, and her eyes, Lord, her eyes held the kind of fear that aged a person decades in seconds. "Please, mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "They killed Papa. They're coming for me." Without hesitation, Tom pulled the child inside, his protective instincts overriding 3 years of careful isolation. She collapsed into his arms, and he felt the sharp edges of ribs through her thin dress. When had she last eaten? How long had she been running? "What's your name, little one?" Tom asked gently, wrapping her in his only blanket. "Sarah," she managed between chattering teeth. "Sarah Whitman. Papa said if anything happened, I should find the man who lives alone, the man who used to help people." Tom's blood ran cold. How could she know? He'd been so careful, so anonymous. "What else did your papa tell you?" Sarah's small hand pressed the crumpled paper into his palm. "He said to give you this. Said you'd understand." Tom unfolded the letter, and his world tilted on its axis. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, written by someone who knew death was coming. To the lawman who still remembers justice, they found out about the deeds. Mayor Hutchins, Sheriff Brady, and the banker Morrison are stealing homestead claims. My family discovered their ledger. They killed my wife tonight. If you're reading this, they got me too. The child knows where the evidence is hidden. Don't let them silence her like they silenced us. James Whitman. Tom's hands trembled as he read the letter twice, then a third time. James Whitman. He remembered the name from town records. A homesteader who'd filed a claim on prime grazing land just south of Dodge City. Land that several prominent citizens had been eyeing for months. "Sarah," Tom said carefully, kneeling to her level, "this evidence your papa mentioned, do you know where it is?" The girl nodded solemnly. "In the old oak tree by Miller's Creek. Papa carved out a hiding spot. There's a metal box with papers inside." Thunder crashed overhead, and Sarah flinched against Tom's chest. Through the window, he thought he saw the distant flicker of torches moving across the prairie. They were coming, just as the child had warned. Tom made his decision in that moment, a decision that would shatter 3 years of careful anonymity and force him back into a world he'd sworn to leave behind. He'd failed to protect innocent people once before, and it had cost him everything: his badge, his reputation, his family's respect. But this child, this terrified little girl who'd lost everything, deserved better than his cowardice. "Sarah, listen to me," Tom said, his voice taking on the authority he'd once wielded as a U.S. Marshal. "We're going to get that evidence, and we're going to make sure the bad men can't hurt anyone else. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." "Where?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with hope and terror. Tom looked out at the storm, calculating distances and dangers. The old Peterson place, abandoned for 2 years, sat hidden in a grove of cottonwoods about a mile north. It would provide shelter while he figured out their next move. "I know a place," he said. "But Sarah, I need you to be very brave. Can you do that?" She nodded, and Tom saw something in her expression that reminded him of another child, his own daughter, lost to him forever because of choices he'd made in the name of justice. As Tom gathered supplies and saddled his horse, his mind raced through possibilities and dangers. Mayor Hutchins controlled the town council. Sheriff Brady wore a badge but served money more than justice. And Morrison, the banker, held the financial strings that could make or break any family in Dodge City. 3 powerful men with everything to lose if their land-grabbing scheme came to light. And now, the only witness to their crimes was a frightened child under his protection. The torches were closer now, maybe a mile out and closing fast. Tom lifted Sarah onto his horse and swung up behind her, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like an old coat. "Hold tight," he whispered, as they rode into the storm. Behind them, the lights of Dodge City flickered like dying stars, and ahead lay a darkness that would test everything Tom Mitchell had once believed about justice, redemption, and the price of doing what's right. The Lonely Rancher's war was about to begin. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over the Peterson homestead, painting the abandoned cabin in shades of desperation. Tom had spent the sleepless night watching the horizon, his Winchester across his knees, while Sarah slept fitfully in the corner. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound might herald their discovery. The child stirred as pale sunlight filtered through the broken shutters. "Mr. Rancher?" she whispered, her voice small and lost. "I'm here, Sarah. You're safe." Tom kept his voice steady, though safety felt as fragile as morning frost. "I dreamed about Mama and Papa," she said, tears threatening. "They were calling for me, but I couldn't reach them." Tom's chest tightened. He'd had similar dreams about his own family, dreams where he could save them if only he moved fast enough, thought clearly enough, chose differently. "They're at peace now, little one, and they'd want you to be brave." A distant sound made Tom freeze, hoof beats approaching from the east. He motioned for Sarah to stay quiet and peered through a gap in the wall. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, but these weren't the torch-bearing hunters from last night. Tom recognized the lead rider immediately. Doc Holliday's cousin, Marcus Holliday, the town's physician and one of the few honest men left in Dodge City. With Doc, Marcus rode 2 unexpected companions: Elena Vasquez, the Mexican woman who ran the boarding house and commanded respect from even the roughest cowboys, and old Pete Garrison, the former cavalry sergeant who now worked as a blacksmith. Tom made a calculated decision and stepped outside, hands visible but ready to draw if necessary. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus said, reining in his horse. "Tom Mitchell. I wondered when you'd surface again." Tom's blood chilled. "Don't know what you mean, Doc." Marcus dismounted, his weathered face creased with something between amusement and concern. "Tom, I treated your bullet wound 3 years ago when you first rode into town. You think I wouldn't recognize the man who cleaned up Tombstone before that business with the Earps went sideways?" Elena spoke up, her accented English carrying the weight of authority. "We know about the child, Senor Mitchell. The whole town is buzzing like angry bees. Sheriff Brady has men searching every building." "Why are you here?" Tom asked, his hand still near his gun. Old Pete spat tobacco juice and fixed Tom with a steely gaze. "Because some of us remember what real law looks like, and because that little girl deserves better than what those bastards have planned for her." Doc Marcus nodded grimly. "Tom, they're not just looking to silence Sarah. Mayor Hutchins has convinced half the town that you kidnapped her. He's offering a $500 reward for your capture, dead or alive." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. $500 was more money than most cowboys saw in 2 years. Every desperate man in 3 counties would be hunting them. "There's more," Elena added. "My boarders talk freely around me. They think Mexican women don't understand important things. Last night I heard Sheriff Brady and 2 strangers planning something for tonight. They mentioned Miller's Creek, Sarah's hiding place." Tom's mind raced. "What kind of strangers?" "Professional men," Pete said meaningfully. "The kind who kill for money and don't ask questions." Tom felt the walls closing in. They knew about the evidence, which meant someone had talked, or they'd tortured the information from James Whitman before killing him. "Why help us?" Tom asked. "You're risking everything." Doc Marcus's expression hardened. "Because 3 months ago, my nephew filed a homestead claim on land near the river. Good land, with water rights. 2 weeks later, he was found dead. Accidental fall from his horse, according to Sheriff Brady. But I examined the body. That boy was beaten to death." Elena's eyes flashed with anger. "My cousin's family, they had a small farm east of town. One day, men came with papers saying the land belonged to someone else. When my cousin protested, his barn burned down. The next week, his cattle were poisoned." Pete nodded grimly. "Same story, different families. Always the same 3 names on the new deeds: Hutchins, Brady, and Morrison. They've been stealing land for over a year, and anyone who objects ends up dead or run out of town." Tom felt a familiar fire kindling in his chest, the same righteous anger that had driven him to pin on a badge 20 years ago. "So what do you propose?" "We get that evidence," Doc Marcus said, "and we make sure it reaches someone who can't be bought. The territorial judge is due in Wichita next week," Elena added. "Judge Harrison. He has a reputation for honesty." "That's a 3-day ride," Tom pointed out, "and they'll be watching every trail." Pete grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Not every trail they won't. I know these plains like the back of my hand. Served with the cavalry for 15 years, chasing Comanche and Kiowa through country most folks never see." Tom looked at these unlikely allies: a doctor, a boarding house keeper, and an old soldier. 3 people who had everything to lose and nothing to gain, except the satisfaction of doing right. "There's something else," Doc Marcus said quietly. "Tom, the whole town knows you used to be a lawman. Word is, you were the marshal who cleaned up Tombstone before the Earp troubles, Some folks remember that you never took a bribe, never backed down from a fight. That was a long time ago, Tom said. Maybe, Elena said, but that little girl in there needs the marshal, not the hermit. As if summoned by her words, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her small face pale but determined. I heard voices. Are these people going to help us? Doc Marcus knelt down to Sarah's level. What's your name, sweetheart? Sarah Whitman. The bad men killed my mama and papa. Well, Sarah Whitman, my name is Doc Marcus, and these are my friends Elena and Pete. We're going to make sure those bad men can't hurt anyone else. Sarah looked up at Tom with eyes that held too much wisdom for her age. Are you really a marshal, Mr. Rancher? Tom felt the weight of his past, his failures, and his fears pressing down on him. But he also felt something else, something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. I was, he said quietly. And maybe I still am. The die was cast. The lonely rancher was about to become Marshal Tom Mitchell once again, and Dodge City would never be the same. The sun hung low over Miller's Creek as Tom and his unlikely band of allies approached the ancient oak tree that held the key to everything. Sarah rode behind Tom, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist, while Doc Marcus, Elena, and Pete flanked them on either side. The evening air carried the scent of approaching autumn and the weight of impending danger. There, Sarah whispered, pointing to a massive oak whose gnarled branches had witnessed decades of prairie storms. Papa showed me the hiding place last month. He said it was our secret. Tom dismounted and helped Sarah down, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding grassland for signs of trouble. The creek gurgled peacefully nearby, but peace was an illusion they couldn't afford. Pete, Elena, keep watch, Tom instructed. Doc, help me with this tree. Sarah led them to the oak's base, where a section of bark had been carefully carved away and replaced. To a casual observer, it looked like natural weathering, but Sarah's small fingers found the hidden catch immediately. Papa was clever, she said proudly. He used to be a carpenter before we came west. The false bark panel swung open, revealing a metal strongbox wedged deep into the tree's hollow. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he pulled it free. Inside this box lay either salvation or their death warrant. The lock had been broken, clearly forced open recently. Tom's heart sank. Sarah, when did your papa hide this? 2 weeks ago, she said. Right after Mama found the papers in town. Tom opened the box, and his breath caught. Despite the broken lock, the contents were intact. Land deeds, bank records, and a leather-bound ledger filled with James Whitman's careful handwriting. But most damning of all was a photograph. Mayor Hutchins, Sheriff Brady, and Banker Morrison standing beside a surveyor's wagon, with a pile of forged documents clearly visible on the tailgate. My God, Doc Marcus breathed, reading over Tom's shoulder. They've stolen over 40,000 acres. That's nearly a quarter of the county. Elena called softly from her lookout position. Riders coming from the north. 6 men, maybe 7. Tom's blood ran cold. They'd been found. Pete, Tom called. How long to reach cover? The old sergeant squinted at the approaching dust cloud. 5 minutes, maybe less. But Tom, there's more riders coming from the south. They were trapped. Tom's mind raced through options, each one ending in disaster. Then Sarah tugged at his sleeve. Mr. Marshal, she said, using his title for the first time. There's another way. Papa showed me a cave by the creek. It's hidden behind the waterfall. Tom looked where she pointed. The creek curved around a small bluff, and he could hear the sound of falling water. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. "Move," Tom ordered, stuffing the evidence into his saddlebags. "Leave the horses. They'll track us anyway." They scrambled down the creek bank as the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder. The waterfall was small but sufficient to mask a narrow cave entrance. One by one, they squeezed through the opening into a space barely large enough for 5 people. Through the curtain of water, they watched Sheriff Brady and his men arrive at the oak tree. With them rode 2 strangers, hard-faced men with the look of professional killers. "Damn it!" Brady's voice carried clearly over the water. "The box is gone." One of the strangers, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, examined the ground around the tree. "Fresh tracks, 5 horses heading toward the creek." "Find them," Brady snarled. "Hutchins wants that evidence destroyed and the girls silenced, permanently." Tom felt Sarah shiver beside him and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. These men weren't just corrupt. They were murderers willing to kill a child to protect their secrets. The searchers spread out along the creek, but the waterfall's mist and the approaching darkness worked in the fugitives' favor. After an hour that felt like eternity, the riders moved on, their curses fading into the night. "We can't stay here," Tom whispered. "They'll be back with more men and dogs." Doc Marcus nodded grimly. "My clinic has a hidden cellar, used to be part of the Underground Railroad. We could hide there until—" "No," Tom interrupted. "Hiding won't solve this. We need to get this evidence to Judge Harrison, and we need to do it before they can destroy more lives." Elena spoke up. "I have a wagon. We could travel at night. Avoid the main roads." "Too slow," Pete said, "and too easy to track. But I know another way." The old sergeant's eyes gleamed with the light of remembered battles. "There's an old Cheyenne trail that runs north through the Badlands. Rough country, but it cuts 2 days off the journey to Wichita. Most white men don't even know it exists." Tom studied the faces of his companions. A doctor who'd lost his nephew, a boarding house keeper who'd seen families destroyed, and an old soldier who remembered when justice meant something. They were risking everything for a principle that seemed increasingly rare in the modern West. "It's dangerous," Tom warned. "If we're caught, they'll kill us all." "They'll kill us anyway if we do nothing," Elena replied. "At least this way, we fight back." Sarah looked up at Tom with eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. "Marshal Mitchell, will this make the bad men pay for what they did to Mama and Papa?" Tom knelt down and took her small hands in his weathered ones. "Sarah, I can't promise it'll be easy, and I can't promise we'll all make it through. But I can promise you this: those men will answer for their crimes." As they prepared to leave their hiding place, Tom felt the familiar weight of his badge. Not the physical badge he'd left behind in Tombstone, but the invisible one that marked a man as someone who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. The lonely rancher was gone forever. In his place stood Marshal Tom Mitchell, and he had a job to finish. The real battle was just beginning. 3 days of hard riding through the Badlands had taken their toll. Tom's small band emerged from the Cheyenne Trail like ghosts from another world, dust-covered, exhausted, but alive. Wichita sprawled before them in the morning sun, its bustling streets a stark contrast to the deadly silence they'd left behind in Dodge City. Judge Harrison's temporary courthouse occupied the 2nd floor of the Occidental Hotel, and Tom could see the territorial flag hanging from the balcony. They'd made it, but their troubles were far from over. "Tom," Doc Marcus said quietly. "Look there." Across the street, two familiar figures lounged against a hitching post. The same scarred gunmen who'd been with Sheriff Brady at Miller's Creek. They'd been followed. "How?" Elena whispered. Pete spat into the dust. "Telegraph. Brady probably wired ahead, told them we were coming." Tom's mind raced. They were so close to justice, but the evidence meant nothing if they couldn't reach the judge alive. Sarah pressed closer to his side, her small hand gripping his coat. "What do we do, Marshal?" she asked. Before Tom could answer, a new voice spoke behind them. "Well, well, if it isn't the famous Tom Mitchell." They turned to see a man in his 50s approaching, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Tom's heart nearly stopped as he recognized Deputy U.S. Marshal William Tilghman, one of the most respected lawmen in the territory. "Bill," Tom said carefully, "didn't expect to see you here." Tilghman's eyes took in the group, the exhausted adults, the frightened child, and the bulging saddlebags that clearly contained something important. "Heard through the grapevine that Tom Mitchell was back in the law business. Thought I'd see for myself. I'm not wearing a badge anymore, Bill." "Maybe not," Tilghman replied, "but you're protecting that child, like a lawman. And those two across the street have been asking questions about a kidnapper and his accomplices. Funny thing is, their description doesn't match what I see here." Tom made a decision that would change everything. "Bill, I need 5 minutes with Judge Harrison. What I have in these saddlebags will expose the biggest land fraud scheme in Kansas history." Tillman studied Tom's face for a long moment. "You know I can't just take your word for it, Tom. Not after what happened in Tombstone." "Then don't take my word," Tom said, pulling out James Whitman's ledger. "Take his." For the next 10 minutes, Tilghman read through the evidence while Tom explained Sarah's story. The deputy marshal's expression grew darker with each page. "Jesus Christ, Tom! This is bigger than land fraud. This is organized theft on a territorial scale." Tilghman looked at Sarah with new understanding. "And they killed her parents to cover it up." "Will you help us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tilghman knelt down to her level. "Little miss, I've been a lawman for 20 years, and I've never seen evidence this clear. Those bad men are going to face justice, I promise you that." But as they approached the hotel, the two gunmen across the street began moving to intercept them. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his Colt. "Easy," Tilghman murmured. "Let me handle this." The deputy marshal stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sun. "You boys looking for someone?" The scarred gunman smiled coldly. "Just some fugitives from Dodge City, kidnapper and his gang." "Funny thing about that," Tillman replied conversationally. "I've got a federal warrant here for the arrest of Sheriff Brady, Mayor Hutchins, and Banker Morrison on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. Seems like the real criminals are back in Dodge City." The gunmen exchanged glances, their hands moving toward their weapons, but Tilghman wasn't alone. 3 more deputy marshals emerged from nearby doorways, rifles ready. "Now, you boys can ride out of town peaceful-like," Tilghman continued. "Or you can explain to Judge Harrison why you're interfering with a federal investigation. Your choice." The scarred man's hand hovered over his gun for a tense moment. Then he slowly raised both hands. "We'll be going now, Marshal." As the gunmen mounted their horses and rode away, Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't running from his past. He was embracing it. Judge Harrison proved to be everything they'd hoped: honest, thorough, and outraged by the evidence. Within an hour, Federal warrants were issued for the arrest of all three conspirators, and a company of cavalry was dispatched to Dodge City to ensure the warrants were served. But the real surprise came that evening as Tom sat with Sarah on the hotel porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Marshal Mitchell," Sarah said quietly. "Yes, little one. I heard Doc Marcus talking to the judge. He said you used to have a family. What happened to them?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, the old pain stirring in his chest. "I had a daughter, about your age, and a wife who believed in justice as much as I did. But where are they now?" "They died," Tom said simply. "In Tombstone 3 years ago. I was so focused on cleaning up the town that I didn't see the danger coming to my own home. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." Sarah slipped her small hand into his weathered one. "Is that why you stopped being a marshal?" "I thought I didn't deserve to wear the badge anymore. Thought I'd failed at the most important job a man can have, protecting his family." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "But you protected me, and you're going to protect other families too, aren't you?" Tom felt tears he hadn't shed in 3 years threatening to fall. "Sarah, would you like to come live with me? I've got a ranch that needs a family, and I think I need someone to protect again." Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I'd like that, Marshal Mitchell. I'd like that very much." 6 months later, Tom Mitchell stood on the main street of Dodge City, a federal marshal's badge once again pinned to his chest. The town had changed. New sheriff, new mayor, and new hope for honest governance. The stolen lands had been returned to their rightful owners, and the territorial legislature had passed new laws to prevent such fraud in the future. But the greatest change was in Tom himself. No longer the lonely rancher, he'd found his purpose again in protecting the innocent and upholding justice. And every evening, he rode home to a little girl who called him Papa and reminded him that sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest acts of courage. Sarah Whitman Mitchell had given him back his faith in justice, and in return he'd given her a family and a future. In the end, that was what justice really meant. Not just punishing the guilty, but protecting the innocent and giving hope to those who had none. The lonely rancher's story had ended, but Marshal Tom Mitchell's legacy was just beginning. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.